You must first remove the normal brake and the emergency brake. Hi, I'm Matt Carr, Field Service Manager here at Torn Drive International. These are the tools you're going to need to change the pedestal bearing on the TGL 1 and 2 machines. Shop towels, an M10 bolt about 4 inches long, an M10 nut, an M12 nut, an 18mm deep well socket, 16mm wrench, an 18mm wrench, 24mm wrench, 36mm wrench, flathead screwdriver, a brass punch, ball peen hammer, soft face hammer, M16 rod cut about 20 inches long, M16 nut, a hydraulic puller, a 30-ton jack, the bearing installation tools that you can get from us here at Torn Drive International, EP2 grease, and a bearing. Using the 16mm wrench, loosen the bolts on the front cover for the pedestal. Now, using a hammer, tap the bolts to loosen the back cover off of the pedestal. Using the 16mm wrench, finish removing the bolts from the pedestal cover. Using the hammer and chisel, remove the pedestal cover from the pedestal. Using the flathead screwdriver, clean the grease out of the bearing on the pedestal. Using a flathead screwdriver and the ball peen hammer, tap back the locking tab on the lock ring. Using the ball peen hammer and the brass punch, knock the locking nut in a counterclockwise direction to loosen it off of the shaft. Remove the locking nut from the shaft. Remove the locking ring from the shaft. Using the 36mm wrench, remove the bolts connecting the pedestal to the base plate. Using the M10 bolt, the M10 nut, and the M12 nut, and also the 18mm socket, remove the pins from the pedestal. Attach the hoist to move the pedestal out of the way. Remove the shims from underneath the pedestal. Be sure to keep them separated as to which side is which. Remove the pedestal. Using the hydraulic puller, pull the bearing off of the shaft. Install the pedestal back onto the bed plate and around the shaft. Line up the bolt holes on the pedestal and install the bolts. Using a hammer, tap the bearing into position on the pedestal and then install the 16mm rod. Next, install the bearing installation tool on the M16 rod. Next, install the hydraulic jack and then the back plate onto the M16 rod. Next, install the M16 nut. Snug it up about hand tight against the back plate. Use the jack to press the bearing into the pedestal and onto the shaft. When the bearing has bottomed out, be sure to reach 15 tons of pressure and then remove the jack, back plate, nut, and bearing installation tool. Remove the M16 rod from the shaft. Reinstall the lock ring and nut back onto the shaft. Using the brass punch and the hammer, tighten the nut onto the shaft. When the nut is tight and the space and the tabs line up between the lock ring and the nut, use a screwdriver to pull one of the tabs up to lock the nut into position. Using the RTV, Put a seal around both the rear cover of the pedestal and the front cover of the pedestal. Add grease to the bearing cover and the bearing and reinstall the bearing cover back onto the pedestal. Install the bolts and using a 16mm wrench, tighten them down. Using the 36mm wrench, loosen the pedestal bolts so that you can put your shims back. Put your shims back in the same locations that you took them out from on your pedestal. Install the pins on the pedestal and then tighten down your bolt using the 36mm wrench. You can now remove the chain fall at this time.